Welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandal. Both authors on this episode will be discussing their debut works, although neither of them is new to the craft of writing. King of Hope is loosely based on a real town's environmental predicament, but the characters are fictional, torn between tradition, change, and an uncertain future. We'll talk to Kim Conklin later in the show to learn more about the people and the problems in her new novel. But our first guest is Jamie Greer, whose book focuses on colourful, real-life figures. This soon-to-be-released book is Killers, Butchers, Crybabies, and Canadian Destroyers, the history of professional wrestling in Windsor. Jamie joins us now to tell us more about how he transitioned from a career in music journalism to penning the area's history of pro wrestling. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Thank you for having me.
So, writing about music and writing about wrestlers.
Yeah, I guess rock and roll and wrestling go hand in hand. I guess I got tired of being in the trenches of rock and roll and decided to go to something a little more tame like pro wrestling.
Yeah. Of course, it's all acting, right?
Yes.
Why do you think that wrestling, pro wrestling, has retained such an appeal?
It's fairy tales and folk tales and mythology all alive at once, wrapped up with that primal force to see good versus evil. To see, and I mean, it's changed. I mean, it's been back to the early days when it was just simply who was the better wrestler. Now it's gotten so big, and with Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik, you've got international rivalries. During the heyday with Stone Cold Steve Austin and Vince McMahon, it was simply the blue collar worker who was fighting against his boss. So there's always a protagonist and antagonist in anything, whether it's just somebody in front of you in driving to work or what have you. So everyone's got a bit of frustration at something or somebody. And I think with wrestling, the personalities have always, people try to connect with them and find something in them. And say, I'm cheering for that guy or that girl. And when they fight, whoever he's fighting just becomes that person. You're like, just thump him.
Yeah, and they do say thump him.
They do.
Now, Windsor, you write in your book, Windsor has over 130 years of history with pro wrestling.
Yes.
And we have a couple of dozen heavyweight champions. Mm-hmm. And all of this has been going on, like I said, for 130 years. How did Windsor become such a hotbed?
Well, pro wrestling as we know it probably started closer, I would say, in the 1910s, 1920s. But I do go back to about the 1880s in the book because that's sort of the earliest sort of legitimate wrestling champions who were kind of on that path. They were doing the kind of circuit shows and things of that nature that kind of morphed into as it became professional wrestling as we know it. Our first official card was in 1929, and we were one of the first territories that were run based out of a gentleman in Toronto named Ivan Mikolev, who was a Russian Siberian promoter who had kind of started pro wrestling in Toronto. That would all kind of collapse, and the Tunnies would take over Toronto and make it one of the bigger promotions in the world. But Windsor kind of separated from Toronto a couple of years in probably about 1932 and became the ally with somebody who was a lot closer than Toronto, and that was Detroit, right across the river. So we really lucked out that we were so close, but yet a country away from another wrestling scene. So for a long time, from probably about mid-40s until the mid-60s, we were very much kind of like the minor system or the farm league for the Detroit system. The main gentleman, Harry Light, who ran the Detroit National Wrestling Alliance territory, as they were called back in the days, in Detroit, was one of the big wigs in the NWA, which was sort of the governing body over all of North America and other parts of the world. So he used Windsor as a place where Canadian, sort of southwestern Ontario and Michigan and some Ohio wrestlers, he would have scouts out there looking for amateur wrestlers or people who had interesting looks. And then he would send them to Windsor and train them. So Windsor became where he would sort of his wrestle factory, where he would build these wrestlers and he would train them over here. He had a gentleman named Bert Ruby and another wrestler named Louis Klein, who did a lot of the training for them. And they were scouting people. I mean, there's a huge number of our wrestlers were all scouted at the YMCA that was originally downtown on Palliser. It's now the Chelsea apartment building.
Right.
But a lot of the wrestlers I found, especially in the sort of the 1960s and earlier, were all that Bert Ruby and Louis Klein would always just be scouting in there. Who's got a good physique? Who looks good? And they'd walk up and say, "Hey, you want to be a wrestler?" And he had quite a few that took over, and Killer Kowalski was actually one of their discoveries. So, I mean...
So, and there's you referenced the Windsor Hall of Heroes.
Yes.
And you say that, in fact, Windsor is tied with places like Montreal and Calgary.
Yeah. That's the WWE Hall of Fame. Yes, the WWE Hall of Fame, which is their annual induction ceremony of all. Now, it's depending what side of history on. Some people aren't too happy with the WWE Hall of Fame, but for the most part, it's the pinnacle of this industry, just because they're the biggest known professional wrestling entity on the planet. So it definitely carries its own weight. Well, this started in 1993, and since then, there's been 17 Canadians have been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Most of people will know most of the bigger names like Bret the Hitman Hart and Roddy Piper and Trish Stratus. But Windsor has two of our own, born and raised in Windsor, and they went on to become international superstars. There's two of them in there. So 2 out of the 17 are from Windsor, and we're tied only with Calgary and Montreal as having more than one. So and that's Abdul the Butcher and Killer Kowalski. So we do have 2 guys in there. So just it goes to show that this area definitely pumped up. And actually, Georgie Animal Steel, who was also in the WWE Hall of Fame, was one of the those ones I mentioned that was actually from Detroit, and he was actually trained over here. We kind of have 2 plus an asterisk.
Yeah. Now, there used to be a syndicated TV show here in Windsor called Superstars of Wrestling.
Yes.
With George Cannon.
Yes. George Cannon was originally from Montreal, but he started wrestling in Windsor in the mid-50s, not too long after he started. And he ended up kind of just getting involved with sort of behind the scenes with the Harry Light office that I mentioned earlier. And so he always had a passion for the behind the scenes stuff. And he ended up settling here, lived in Russell Woods until he passed away.
How long ago did he die?
He died in 1994. He died on Canada Day after a battle with cancer. But he was a wrestler for many years. In the early 70s, he was a larger man, and he just couldn't do the moves he could do anymore. But he was always great on the microphone, the gift of gab, and he became a manager. And then in the mid-70s, he decided to start his own promotion called Superstars of Wrestling. And it was he filmed it all over Canada, but he did do Windsor tapings at the CKLW studio, now the CBC studio, and on the Riverside there. And he wasn't the first. Actually, Harry Light in Detroit, they taped all their Detroit TV was taped over here.
Right.
So the Detroit TV wrestling shows were taped over here.
Now, we've got Andre the Giant,
Yes.
and I notice you've got him
Wearing
on
the
your
shirt,
shirt, who was pinned by the guy you have mentioned a couple of times, Killer Kowalski, who had other names, Tarzan,
Yeah,
and a few
Tarzan,
others.
Yeah.
But these people were often very kind, and you meet them and they're lovely people.
Yeah.
And I know even in conversations with our production crew, they talk about, how they heard about, how friendly and everything they were. So is it all about acting?
Well, it's, they hate when you say the word fake, just because...
Well, we used acting.
Yeah, because, I mean... you still get punched in the mouth, or you get slammed onto your back. I mean, people think it's a trampoline, or it's wood covered in canvas.
And they bounce.
They do, but if you throw anyone onto a plank of wood, you're going to bounce. But they've got bruises. There's been careers. People have died in the ring. In fact, one of Windsor's own, Louis Papineau, died in the ring, or shortly after he got taken out of the ring. So I mean, the risks are very real. The only thing is that the endings are predetermined, we should say.
Okay.
I mean, there's obviously ways to pull punches or to certain things, but there are some things that all you can do is grin and bear it.
Right.
And it's funny when people say that, but it's like, well, you watch Ozark or you watch The Avengers, and it's not real either, is it?
What's the biggest revelation?
I think it was just how deep our history went. Like I said, I started the idea of it anyway, during the pandemic, because I had lots of time on my hands and not much else to do. And I was writing for another site called Last Word on Sports. I was writing for their wrestling department, and I had just started writing. I just written for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and I always liked the historical aspects of it. I mean, I'd known that we had Killer Kowalski and Abdullah the Butcher. I knew we had a strong connection with Impact Wrestling, formerly at TNA, because Scott D'Amore from Windsor is one of the executives there that pretty much essentially runs the company, or the TV side of it anyway. And we've always had a lot of wrestlers that he's brought there through borders. So I knew there was some connections. It was actually when I was starting to interview or work on an article about Sandy Parker for one of the sites I worked at, that I was like, wait a second. She lived in Windsor and started her career in Windsor.
She has a very interesting background.
It's an amazing story.
And we are running out of time, but we still have so much to talk to.
Yes.
But do quickly tell us about her.
Well, she came from Vancouver. She was a big wrestling fan. She wanted to get into the business. Apparently, she had some family in this area, and so she moved to Windsor in 1968 and lived here for about 3-4 years. But she trained with Louis Klein over in Detroit, and she ended up going on to Japan, and she won the world championship over there. And in doing so, she became the first black woman to win a world championship in pro wrestling. And she also became the first LGBTQIA wrestler to win a world championship. And that was in 1973. And she went on a pretty phenomenal story.
2 quick questions. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was here was it in LaSalle 25 years ago?
Yes.
Everybody knows him.
1997. Yeah, his only indie date, his only date outside of the WWE universe was here. And
wow,
you'll have to read the book to find out the story of why. That's probably why he didn't have any more after that.
Okay, one quick thing: Impact Wrestling returned to Windsor in 2022. So what are fans as avid today as they were?
Well, it was announced in 2022. The shows are just coming up, and I think they are, because we were really sort of hitting our momentum. Impact, Scott D'Amore has been bringing Impact back to Windsor for TV tapings, and we were really getting a good crowd for it. People loved seeing us on TV because we were such a rabid fan base. So I think it's been about 2 years since we've had it. So we're going to be excited. It's going to be a good one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, books about wrestling generally, can be a bit dry. This is really interesting.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you.
You're right.
Killers, Butchers, Crybabies and Canadian Destroyers, The History of Professional Wrestling in Windsor is expected to be published very soon, and you'll want to pick it up. Our second guest is a screenwriter, filmmaker, and one of the podcast hosts of All Right in Sin City. Her communication works have been recognized with more than 15 awards, including a Clio and a New York International Film Festival award. Her debut novel, King of Hope, is set on the shores of Lake Erie in the fictional town of Port d'Espoir. The name despair implies a loss of hope, but also the opposite, from the French word espère, hope. The story follows a cast of characters and their struggle to answer some difficult questions about the environment and their place in it. describing the genre of her novel as Southern Ontario Gothic with an environmental twist. Kim Conklin is here now to explain what this means and tell us more about King of Hope. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you again, Vera.
You too. So, Southern Ontario Gothic.
Yes. Well, I mean, there is a Southern Gothic tradition that goes back a long way, and Southern Ontario is kind of related to that. And it just has a little bit more of a Canadian flair, really. It's about, idyllic settings, usually somewhat remote, that have, a little something scary going on underneath. So.
And you're in good company with Southern Gothic authors like Faulkner and Harper Lee. So it's pretty impressive.
Oh, well, I mean, I certainly wouldn't compare myself to those writers, but yeah, we're certainly working in the same genre.
Now, I mentioned you having a writing background, and you've written screenplays and short films, and of course your podcast. What inspired you to write a book?
Well, when I first came to Canada, I was lucky enough to study with Alistair MacLeod at some of the workshops at the U.
Wonderful author.
Yes, and a wonderful teacher. And that kind of inspired me to start working on fiction. And I love the work that I do, but it was a way to kind of grow and challenge myself a little further. So, yeah, I've been working on it.
And where'd you come from?
I came from Michigan, so yeah.
So not too far.
Not too far.
So did you know Windsor before you came here?
Not very well. No, I didn't. I came from sort of the middle part of the state, although I'd lived in Detroit for a little while before I came here. But no, I really don't think Americans understand Canada that well. It's different in subtle ways. So. Mm-hmm.
So tell us a little bit about the book, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about how it connects to Port Hope.
Well, the story is about a small town that is facing radical environmental uncertainty and has been for generations. And yes, it is inspired by the situation in the real Port Hope, although I've never been there, don't know anything about that particular town, just borrowed the situation that they're living in to create this. And they have a lot of piles of uranium waste sitting around and have for a long time. And what I was interested in when I started working on the novel was how that kind of radical uncertainty divides people, how it kind of polarizes even a small community where you would think things would be, there would be a lot more common ground, but it doesn't always. So that was part of what I was, trying to work with.
Did you have an opportunity to talk to environmentalists or anyone even remotely connected to Port Hope during the research period of your book?
A little, not very much. A lot of it was done through newspaper research and whatnot. It's more of an emotional journey than it is trying to find facts or anything. Mm-hmm. It's more about, sort of how people respond to living in that situation.
You've got quite a cast of characters. And of course, the lead character, Hart, mm-hmm. who is also the somewhat reluctant mayor. Tell me about him.
Well, he's the kind of guy that, he traveled when he was younger, wound up coming back, not really sure why. And he's the kind of guy that everybody likes, he's very amicable. And because they like him, they keep writing his name in on the ballot. He never really actually even ran for mayor, but he feels a real responsibility to the town. So it kind of, it drags him into the middle of the situation, and he spends most of his time and energy trying to figure this situation out and where there may not actually be a solution. So,
and he's got some oddities about him and his imagination. I mean, you're never certain sometimes where his imagination's taking him.
Well, he's having visions. Mm-hmm. He knows he's having visions. He doesn't really want to know why he's having visions. He knows he doesn't want to think of them as visions because that's too religious. But it could be anything. It could be stress. It could be, some kind of a tumor. It could be, he doesn't really want to know what the problem is. He's just hoping it will go away. But yeah, he's having these wild visions everywhere he goes. So, yeah.
And you sort of read about his visions, but he also has this love of the stars and and fall, which goes against everything that everybody else in the town feels. Nobody else likes fall.
No, everybody likes summer because summer's happy time, and fall suggests something else. And so that's a little bit of his perhaps romanticism, that he likes things that are a little bit on the edge. And
And I have to say, one of the words you used when you were talking about how he enjoys the fall and the stars, etc. You call it a gibbous moon. And I hadn't heard that word used for a very long time. So I thought it was a lovely inclusion of a word that most people don't use.
Well, I was trying to make port, and most people say it Desbier because that's more the English version, and you're the first person to pronounce it correctly. Port Desbier. I was trying to make it a little bit of a mythical kind of place. I mean, it's real, but have that sort of otherworldly quality about it. So there are some maybe older words here and there, and maybe some imagery and things that, kind of harken back to fairy tales and whatnot. Yeah.
And another character that I thought was rather interesting was Ronnie. Tell us about Ronnie.
Ronnie's the outsider. It's Hart's wife. And she finds herself in this little town, which is very divided. She's married to the guy that everybody loves, but they don't really want him to be married. They want to keep him for themselves. So they're kind of tough on her. Yeah.
It's a very interesting take on a character and on a relationship that the town wants him not to be married to her. Mm-hmm. That the town actually sees him as theirs. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Where in your brain did that come from?
I mean, I think every community has some sort of a gestalt. It's got that script that they all work from. And once you're in the script, and I think Chloe, one of the characters, talks about it. Once you're in the script, don't rewrite the script. And so she's somebody that came from outside to a place where the script was written when they were really young. So it's a little less flexible than it might be in a city or somewhere else. And they don't know what to do with her. And she's very different than they are. She has a different kind of job. She has a different kind of background. She has maybe different ideas because she's lived in in Montreal, in a city and that kind of thing. And they're not too sure that they like the kind of change that she represents or the newness. Yeah.
And they didn't seem very enamored of her Frenchness.
No, they didn't care for that at all either. So, yeah.
And you mentioned the other character, Chloe. Mm-hmm. Tell us about Chloe. I thought she was hilarious.
Chloe is the girl in high school that, she was very successful in high school and just carries that straight through. I mean, she's the girl that, communicates to her friends through party activities. And, she's the first one up dancing, and she's always getting other people to dance and, cheering everybody on. She also quietly manipulates things a bit in the background because, she knows how the social world works in this small community, so.
And there was a review in the Miramichi Reader, and it said, King of Hope is a small story with small but recognizable characters, some stereotypically so. How different, really, are small town characters compared to city characters? Is there...
That surprised me when I read that. It's like, I mean, I didn't feel like it was a slam or anything, but it surprised me. It was sort of like, well, I think there are those kinds of characters anywhere that you go. I mean, I've lived in small towns. I've also lived in cities. And, there are quirky people everywhere. I mean, maybe how they relate to each other is a little bit more fluid in a city, but not always so, because you can develop even a small community in a neighborhood where things can kind of form in the same way,
Do you know, as I was reading, I kept getting the feeling of an American small town. I don't know why that was. Did that come from your subconscious?
Possibly. Yeah. I mean, I probably have lived half of my life with one foot on either side of the border. So I suppose I mix it up a little bit, but yeah.
Would you say there was much of a difference in how you lived in a small town in Michigan compared to here?
Well, I mean, there are differences. If you're talking about differences in terms of how people relate to each other and how the script develops, that's pretty similar. That seems to be just sort of human. But there are differences in terms of people's worldview or, what they expect of things or how they define, certain kinds of behavior or whatever. That's different. But really, sort of how they relate to one another, how communities form and how they, agree or disagree, that seems to be pretty universal across the board.
Was it conscious that I seem to sort of get some socio-political statements?
In the sense that I was just trying to create a picture of where we are today. And it also kind of is sort of a description of the end of the world, I mean, sort of in those, trying to add those fairy tale elements or whatever. It's sort of like, okay, we're at this point, right? So really that was all that was about. So.
And you were saying, and you said in your acknowledgement that you spent some time doing yoga in yoga studios in Quebec. What was it about yoga or the locations? Did that factor into how you wrote the book?
Yes, it did, very much so. But it had more to do with the people that I was with. This is when I lived in Montreal, because I've been working on the book kind of on and off for a very long time. And I started it up there. And I probably wasn't in a really great place in my life, in my outlook or whatever. And I started doing yoga with a very good friend who's from New Zealand and very cheerful and just very upbeat. And we wound up, we took yoga from a former comedy screenwriter named Len Bloom. And, it's kind of like 3 days a week we went and just laughed and, stretched our muscles to the point that we had to, bathe in Epsom salts or something. But that sort of, I don't know, it was a really joyful time, and it added some of the lighter and more playful elements to the book, I think.
Because without it, it probably could have become very dark.
Very dark, yes. And I didn't want it to do that. Mm-hmm. So.
And I'll just sort of tell people that there's also a very interesting animal character in your book. And we won't give anything away, but I thought he was very, very interesting.
There's actually a couple. There is the muskrat, and then, of course, there's Boyd Banta the chicken.
So, yes, yeah. That's right. Mm-hmm. Yes, a muskrat and a chicken. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed them. Kim, thank you so much. It's been delightful, and all the best with your book.
Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, that's all for this episode of Scribes and Songsters. Many thanks to our guests, authors Jamie Greer and Kim Conklin. And just a reminder, we'll be bringing back Jamie once his book is published in the spring. I'd like to say a special thanks to our Scribes and Songsters team, producer Liz Pettipies-Phillips, technical producer and editor Gary Glass, social media manager Michelle Fortier, and consultant Brian Sweet. Grateful thanks to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation, and to Neil and Tina Queering for their support. Thank you for listening and watching, and I hope to see you soon right back here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandal. Bye for now.